So let's pick up where we left off last time with the fall of the Roman Empire, a change big enough to bring the entire classical period to an end. And in order to discuss why that happened and why we enter a new period in history and how the fall of Rome sets us up for this new period in history, we need to really imagine the kind of change that happened when the Roman Empire ceased to exist. And one of the cool things about learning history and learning social studies generally is society kind of follows patterns and it's made up of humans who make decisions kind of like you might. So if we can find a way to put ourselves in sort of an imaginary society and reason through how people would behave, we can better understand how people reasoned in the past. And one of the best ways to really with hierarchy and power in governments is to think about the society that you guys know best with its own power structure that you guys are super familiar with, a school. So imagine Yes Prep West, our school, is the Roman Empire. So picture yourself at school, before COVID, of course, as normal. Normal school, normal power structures. When you're in school, you have a certain way of behaving. There are rules. There are incentives to do certain things. There's a purpose to being there. It's to learn stuff. And there is a system of authority that keeps all of that going, sometimes by issuing consequences, but often just by being there. Just the presence of teachers and administrators in a building encourages people to act a certain way, forming what you could call a school culture, a school civilization, if you want. So imagine you're at school. It's normal. People are in uniform, people are doing what they're supposed to do, people treat each other in a relatively civilized manner. Then pick what might happen if from one day to the next, all of the authority figures, all of the adults just vanish. Not just in the school, but like say it's all of Houston, so you can't escape this thought experiment by just leaving the building. Right. So the people who enforce the rules are gone. Not only that, though, their expertise is gone. The people who know how to budget for a school are no longer there. The people who know how to deal with, I don't know, the plumbers when a pipe breaks are no longer there. All of the technical know-how that goes into running a school, it's not just enforcing rules, right? It's like knowing how to actually do things that you guys as students don't know how to do because it's not relevant to your lives in this particular moment in time. Well, now all those adults are gone, so you're on your own. And then imagine further that there is an incredibly limited food supply and that this is not going to get better all by itself. Nobody is going to drop off food. You are on your own. What happens next? Picture it. In this context, how long would school rules last? Would anything about school culture feel the same? And think really hard about who would have power in this context and why. Often it would be the strongest, right? The people who could use their physical power to get the resources that they need. Think about who wouldn't survive and why. Say this goes on for a year or two. So like a long time, right? In relative terms, if you're living through it, but through the view of history, a very short period of time. After surviving like this for a while, if you make it, would anybody care why whatever it takes or going to college are written on the walls? Would anybody still follow basic rules, even like hygiene? If the bathroom broke 3 months ago, like where are people going to do their business? It's probably going to get pretty gross pretty fast. And it's probably going to be a very tougher place to be. Then think further. Obviously, in this context, nobody is going to sit themselves down and try to learn algebra or practice their writing or teach the younger people how to read and write. You're probably going to be focused on your own survival, and that's kind of it. It doesn't take long in times of crisis like this for knowledge, culture, civilization to evaporate. And that is a dramatized version of what happened when the Roman Empire fell in Western Europe. We're going to get to the story of how people survived and created something entirely new, the feudal system, in the next unit. In this unit, we're going to be focused on what happened everywhere else that the Roman Empire had touched. On the top left of the slide, you will see in red an outline of the extent of the Roman Empire at its strongest. Right, so like that whole territory rethinks itself after 476 CE. In the west, we have the rise of barbarian kingdoms. In the Eastern Roman Empire, centered around where modern-day Turkey is, we have the rise of what's called the Byzantine Empire, followed like Roman culture to a certain extent. And then in North Africa and the Middle East, we have a power vacuum. So like authority figures are gone, which leaves space for something new to rise. So because we have completely new civilizations in Europe and completely new civilizations that arise in the Middle East, we turn the page kind of on history and start calling this new time period after the fall of the Roman Empire the post-classical period, because it's after the classical period. Now in Western Europe, like I said, the barbarian invasions of Rome gave rise to barbarian kingdoms that are listed on the map. In the east, you had the Byzantine Empire. But focused on the west, Europe enters what's called something of a dark age. Dark not only because it was a tougher place to live, but also because we don't have very many historical sources. Because, like, picture yourself back at school in a time of chaos where you're trying to survive. Are you going to stop and write a lot of documentation to tell future generations about like how hard life is? No, you're going to just try to survive. So, not a ton of sources. And it develops a culture that is Christian still. That's the only thing that really survived from Rome, but intolerant of other religions. It's an insecure kind of Christianity that we're going to learn about a lot, that takes out that insecurity in violent ways. It's a place where there are no safe roads. Not only are they no longer paved, so they're like really hard to get around, but they're not protected anymore. So long distance trade stops affecting Western Europe in the same way that it did under Rome. There is no big, large-scale communication with other parts of the world anymore. And because the central government that used to issue coins is no longer in existence, Europe switched to a land-based economy. So you get your wealth from owning a plot of land, and you want to protect yourself, so you give knights a plot of land to protect you. And then you want to feed yourself, but you don't want to make your own food because you're rich and rich people don't like working. So you get peasants, you let them live on parts of your land too, little teeny tiny parts, but they have to produce enough food for everybody. And if they don't, they're the ones who starve first. In this land-based economy, there is no social mobility. There is no way to improve your station in life. And so it's kind of a very bleak, dark place, especially at the beginning. Like I said, the only thing that really survived is Christianity, which is kind of funny because it was an idea that Rome resisted at first. It was an idea that arose against Rome, and yet it wins. So that's the Europe story, and we're going to get to that part of the story in the next unit. In this unit, we're going to start by looking at the Middle East and North Africa, which is sometimes lumped in with the Middle East, and the rise and expansion of Islamic civilization. Now here we have a very different story than the one you just heard about Western Europe. It's all opposites. We're going to get to it in detail, but the short version is Islamic civilization arose and very quickly became strong as a centralized empire. It was focused like a laser on trade, and trade brought wealth and knowledge and ideas to the civilization. And because Islam is related to Christianity and Judaism, the Islamic Empire was tolerant of these other religions, So like nobody was going to get killed or tortured for continuing to be Christian or Jewish. They did have to pay a tax, but that was also in place of the charity tax that Muslims had to pay for the poor. So long story short, whereas Europe is very dark and bleak in this time period, the Islamic world is a vibrant civilization experiencing an amazing golden age. So our story is going to really center in Arabia and then kind of spread out, much like Islam and the empire did as well. Arabia is like kind of the hub of the Middle East, right? And in lighter orange along North Africa, you have a region that is sometimes lumped in with the Middle East, sometimes not. But when it is, it's often because of a common culture that originated in this time period owed to this first Islamic expansion. Another big characteristic of this region that comes in big time to make a difference in this story is its physical geography. North Africa is dominated by the Sahara Desert. It is huge, and for a lot of history, it was an impermeable barrier, especially before people figured out how to use camels to effectively like travel through the desert. So the Sahara Desert, obviously you can't grow agriculture there unless you're like in Egypt along the Nile. So it's home to pastoral nomads. Then we look at Arabia. And Arabia has a similar climate, and it's also home to pastoral nomads. Arabia is dry. It is a desert in most of the peninsula. And so you have like the Middle East, right? And North Africa, which I am lumping in with the Middle East for the purposes of this class, that rises to produce a civilization that has a golden age in a place that is geographically like, it's really hard to do that in a desert. So this is fascinating. And in this unit, we need to figure out why. Part of the answer is going to have a lot to do with the skills that nomads have, pastoral nomads, because they live in deserts, because they live in these harsh climates. One of those skills is that they tend to be amazing on horseback because they move around a lot. And this is going to come in pretty handy in battles. Another thing that comes out of this is because you move around a lot, because there's a desert, and because, as we learned in the last unit, pastoral nomads are pretty central to making long distance trade work for other people. This like kind of cultural ability to trade feeds into the new Islamic civilization that makes it a very like trade-based empire, as we will see. So we arrive at our key points, which summarize what I've basically just said. The post-classical age is the time period after the fall of Rome, after the classical period, and before Columbus sails to the Americas, roughly from the year 600 to 1450-ish, but these things are always approximations. You may have heard this time period referred to as the Middle Ages, medieval, or the Dark Ages. The theme that dominates the post-classical age is that these are the civilizations that arise in the power vacuums that classical Rome and China left behind. And they form something new. In Europe, Europe experiences a really steep decline in the standard of living compared to how it was under the Roman Empire. Instead of being one big empire, it's now fragmented in lots of tiny, independent, warring kingdoms, isolated from the rest of Eurasia, with no meaningful long-distance trade to speak of. It's intolerant of non-Christians. And because of this big decline in standard of living, because everybody was focused mostly on surviving before anything else, very few historical records can tell us about this time period, because literacy tanked too. So it's often referred to as the Dark Ages, especially in the beginning, like in the several hundred years after the fall of Rome. Islamic civilization, on the other hand, rises and thrives in the Middle East during this time period to experience a golden age fueled by trade and tolerance. So, big contrast. Another relatively big shift, especially towards the beginning of this time period, is how trade kind of starts to work differently. Silk Road trade, in the immediate aftermath of the fall of these empires, no longer was safe because you need a big, strong empire to protect roads. Otherwise, like you're walking around in the middle of nowhere with lots of valuables, you're going to get robbed. So new trade networks emerge, and they become really, really, really important to the story of why exactly Islamic civilization does so well. The first is Trans-Saharan Trade. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's trade across the Sahara Desert using camels. And the second is Indian Ocean trade, which connected Arabia to East Africa, China, Southeast Asia, India also, obviously. So we're going to be looking at all of that this unit. Here is a preview of basically everything we're going to learn in this unit, all on one concept map. So if you're a concept mapping type person, it's worth making a pause on this slide and maybe get this down into your notes. We're going to go over each of these elements lesson by lesson, so I'm not going to narrate all of it yet, but some of you guys like previews, and so here is yours. And then finally, pictures. What would a good video be without pictures? So our story tomorrow is going to begin in Arabia. And when we talk about Arabia, this is roughly what I want you to picture.